We need to show that corruption is a punishable offense, that there are repercussions for it, not against journalists, but against the people who are guilty of the crimes. And in that way, begin changing the culture too, because I have to say that it's also a cultural problem.
It's my pleasure to welcome today's panelists, the audience in the room, and of course our viewers online, to our press conference, Corruption and Democracy. Today we'll be discussing really the key findings of Transparency International Corruption Perception Index and getting some feedback and context in specific countries. Today I'm joined by Delia Ferreira Rubio, Chair of Transparency International, Dr. Mokgweetsi Masisi, President of the Republic of Botswana, and Matthew Caruana Galizia, Director of Daphne Caruana Galizia Foundation. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
First, let's start with the report. It was just launched. Delia, could you please share with us the key findings and really the surprises in that ranking?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. The Corruption Perception Index is an instrument that we have been running for more than 20 years from Transparency International, and we have launched it today. It's an index on perceptions of academic experts and business sector on the corruption in the public sector of countries. We are not measuring here money laundering, illicit financial flow, asset recovery, or things like that. Just public sector corruption. We use 13 sources, and we have measured 180 countries this year on a scale that goes from 100, which means perceived as very clean, to 0, perceived as very or highly corrupt. And I will tell you the best performing countries and also those at the bottom. But what is important is that we are not just making numbers of these. We are correlating these results with certain aspects of governance, of rule of law, and other characteristics of our democracies. And there is a clear correlation, repeated year after year, between corrupt countries and weakened political institutions, or a weak rule of law, lack of trust in institutions, the undermining of democracy. This correlation is clear. Corruption means this. We are not talking about casual things. We are talking about things that correlate. And this year we incorporated another factor, which is the influence of big money in politics and the correlation between campaign financing, regulation and enforcement, and corruption or transparency. And there is a clear correlation between countries where corruption is high and the regulation is not existent or is weak in terms of campaign finance or money and politics, or you have good rules but very bad enforcement of that rules. This correlation is clear. The best performing countries and the average, the global average this year in the scales 100 to 0 is 43, so there is no great improvement globally. And the best performing countries are Denmark and New Zealand, Finland, Singapore, Sweden, Switzerland, and those at the bottom part of the index are Venezuela in Latin America, Yemen, Syria, South Sudan, and Somalia. And of course, there are in each region well-performing countries, and I really have to thank the presence of President Masisi, because Botswana is the yellow country. If you see our map, we have yellow for the countries that are clean or perceived as clean and transparent, and the red means corruption. And in the sub-Saharan region, the only yellow spot is Botswana, so congratulations for all your efforts. You can find all the material in transparency.org, and you can find detailed analysis region by region, the countries that have performed better in each region. And one other thing that we incorporated this year is the relation or the responsibility that countries that are performing well in terms of the index and their responsibility in global corruption, because the money that is stolen in the countries perceived as corrupt ends in banks and fortunes and luxury things in the countries that are seen as transparent. So corruption is a global problem and has to be tackled by the global community. As the Manifesto 2020 says this year, we need collective action and a stakeholders approach if we are going to stop corruption. I will leave it there.
President Masisi, Delia reflected on how Botswana is this shining yellow dot on the map. Could you share with us your views on Sub-Saharan Africa's performance, and more specifically on the fact that Botswana ranked second in the region and 34 globally? What is Botswana doing right?
Well, thank you very much. I guess it's a matter of interpreting an objective result rather than an act of kindness on our part to suggest that we're doing well. So I will take that back with me home and really thank the institutions and all the citizens of Botswana for doing this. But we remain dissatisfied. Our fight against corruption is a race to a finish line that never ends. So it does not mean there is no corruption in Botswana. There is corruption, but you've got to be dynamic in responding by plugging the holes to that corruption. Botswana exists not in isolation. We are part of Southern Africa, we are part of Africa, we are part of the global community. And the very fact that we could attempt as much as we have to extricate ourselves of negative influences speaks a lot to our governance. We're a democratic country, and democracy is incomplete without transparency, without accountability. And so we do get held accountable for what we do. But we also in government do play a part, as we have done recently, when in the perception of many, corruption seemed to be growing, or those who were perceived to be corrupt seemed to be getting away scot-free. And so we closed a big hole, a gap. We passed legislation, law, which requires all political leaders, right from my level, those in the National Assembly and Council, all senior public officers, and those in the judiciary, to declare publicly their assets and their liabilities. We put in place, these are very recent developments, we put in place a Directorate of Integrity, managed in the Office of the President, for the simple reason that it's supposed to bear its influence on other institutions of the state. And the judiciary is responding likewise by, they have a dedicated judge for anti-corruption, and we hope they will increase the number of judges that are dedicated to that. We've also passed a number of other pieces of legislation, such as protection of whistleblowers, and amended the Corruption the Corruption and Economic Crimes Act to tighten the loose ends, because we keep learning from what we do. But you see, corruption is multifaceted. They are the motivators of corruption, and they are the actors, and then they are the beneficiaries. You always would have, in a third world developing country like mine, actors who often act in cahoots with players who ply their trade and residence in countries that are not in Africa, and who reside or are citizens of countries that are perceived to have very low level of corruption. And so I think it is time, particularly for Transparency International, to take the bull by the horns and let's start following, tracking, reporting on those who benefit from corruption. You know, international piracy, which this amounts to, is a system whereby you tolerate the extortation of funds, resources from a state to another state, and then you legitimize it because you've discovered that they're not democratic or not respecting human rights, and you seize the assets of such. This behavior needs to stop because it continues to marginalize developing countries. And finally, I would have expected these chairs to be packed with people who are all in the value chain of corruption. And they're missing. Because anti-corruption is a means, though not complete or enough sufficient, to realization of the SDGs. You cannot, you never will realize your SDGs or your development challenges, however developed or sophisticated you are, when corruption continues to persist at the levels that it does. And a lot of it, is to do with poverty, inequity, no clean water, pollution, environmental mismanagement, etc. So because we subscribe to these good values, we do it because it's the right thing to do for development. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we move on to the question, I'd like to invite Matthew to talk about the fact that Malta has significantly declined in the CPI. It's dropped 6 points since 2015. Can you explain to us what has contributed to this decline and classification of Malta as a country to watch?
Okay, perhaps for people who aren't aware of why I'm here exactly, my mother was an investigative journalist investigating corruption in Malta, who was murdered in 2017. And that murder did not happen in isolation. It wasn't an isolated attack. It happened specifically because Malta's government chose to go in the exact opposite direction of, for example, Botswana's government, and practically adopt corruption rather than anti-corruption as a policy. And when a government chooses to do this, because it is a choice, then that automatically puts journalists who investigate corruption in great danger and leads to murders, which is why my mother was murdered. That started, I suppose, with the election to government of our former prime minister. Malta already had weak institutions to begin with, but the government's program of privatization, selling passports, granting licenses to banks from Iran, just fomented more corruption. And as journalists like my mother began to publish evidence of this corruption, instead of fighting that corruption, fighting those crimes, the government doubled down and began to take measures to decapitate the authorities and institutions of the state that are supposed to be fighting that corruption. So things just got worse and worse. Once the government did that in order to protect people in government, in order to protect corrupt officials, it opened up the door to more transnational organized crime. And eventually things went into a spiral of decline, which is why Malta's ranking has continued to fall and why it continues to be a country to watch. Now, our way out of this is very clear, I mean, journalists can continue publishing evidence of corruption, but unless our authorities are reformed or start acting in the way they should, then we're going to continue being in danger. So yes, our institutions need to be reformed. We need Malta to implement the recommendations of the Council of Europe, but we need our authorities to begin acting immediately. We need to show that corruption is a punishable offense, that there are repercussions for it, not against journalists, but against the people who are guilty of the crimes. And in that way, begin changing the culture too, because I have to say that it's also a cultural problem.
Thank you. And we've seen some of that exemplified by Isabel dos Santos being charged today.
Yes, I mean, that's a really good example because, of course, she's an extremely corrupt figure, took advantage of weak systems of governance within her country, took advantage of nepotism, but she was enabled by accountants and lawyers in Malta and elsewhere. Malta's government turned a blind eye to the money laundering money laundering occurring in Malta that was allowing her to siphon all of this money that belonged to the public of Angola. And in that way, things just got worse and worse for the people of Angola. But things also get worse in Malta, because what do vested interests have to do in order to allow this money laundering to happen, the transnational money laundering? They have to weaken the institutions in my own country, in Malta. They have to weaken institutions in Europe. So, as you said, we really need to work together to make sure that we're fighting what is actually transnational organized crime and corruption together. Otherwise, if there are weak countries like Malta that continue to enable the corruption of Isabel dos Santos or the corruption of Maltese officials, then, I mean, things are just going to continue to get worse.
So Tila, if you want to add.
To add to what have just been said about Malta, in this Dos Santos scandal, the role of gatekeepers has been of key importance. Gatekeepers should do their work. Gatekeepers are bankers, accountants, lawyers, so assurance companies, investment companies. So we need this fight against corruption to be done as a stakeholder task, including governments, including citizens. Of course, investigative journalists are key in the fight against corruption. And we need the business sector. We were talking yesterday at the Pachi meeting. We need the business sector to participate actively in the fight against corruption, not only because of values, integrity, or ethics, but because of clear, effective influence of corruption in competitiveness, in the capacity to do business and to obtain profits. So if they don't want to participate out of values, they can participate out of very concrete things. And we need the engagement of civil society and citizens. If societies tolerate corruption, they will keep sending the wrong message to the corrupt guys. You can go on because we keep on voting you, for instance, or we keep on buying your products because it doesn't matter. Well, yes, corruption matters in terms of SDGs, in terms of human rights, in terms of democracy. So we have to work together. It's the only way.
In fact, the position of my family is that while justice for my mother after her murder is important, it's the #1 priority for us, we're never going to be able to bring her back. So the best that we can do to make sure that she didn't die in vain is to make sure that a country like Malta doesn't end up in the situation ever again. Because we weren't so corrupt to begin with. Things were allowed to get worse over time. And how can we do this? Civil society needs to be engaged, but really the only solid way to do it is to have effective supranational mechanisms that fight money laundering and cross-border crime and corruption. Because once Malta joined the European Union in 2004, once that happened, we were flooded with new money without the ability to fight the crime that comes with it. So within zones of free trade where money flows freely, like the European Union or other regional free trade groups that are forming, you need to have some level of compromise where states agree to give up some of their sovereignty with respect to the rule of law, the fight against money laundering and corruption. It's really the only way.
So I'm going to open up the floor to see if there are any questions in the room. The gentleman in the back. Please state your name and your media outlet.
My name is Mokit. I come from Botswana. My question goes straight to Transparency International. I would like to know what your organization, Rubio, is doing to ensure that good efforts by countries such as Botswana are sustained in terms of building capacities. Because it's important to have such good support systems, or we will be fighting a losing battle. Thank you.
We're going to take a couple of questions. Are there any other questions? The gentleman in the front.
I am Alan Guimol from daily newspaper La Croix, French daily paper, and I have a question to Mr. Caruana Galizia. I'm sorry to be so bad informed about Malta, but don't you consider that there was some effort done in Malta since the murder of your mother? There was not so any reaction from the government or any reform to fight against corruption? And also, I have a question to Ms. Ferreira Rubio about France. I saw that in your index, France withdrew from 4 points since the last index. And it's difficult for me to understand why there was this downsize of France. So if you can give me an explanation, please. Thank you very much.
And we're going to take one more question, if there's any other questions on the floor. Yes.
Hi, my name's Tim Cohen. I work for a publication called Daily Maverick in South Africa. I just wanted to ask Ms. Rubio to what extent extradition is, to what extent you think extradition, changing extradition laws would be helpful here. In South Africa, we're very frustrated with, people see that the things are changing and then, they move to a country, they move their money and they move to a country where there's no extradition agreement, and then you're really stuck. It's important for civil society to see that people who are corrupt do get eventually prosecuted, and if they're not living in your country anymore, it's difficult to achieve that.
And I know a couple of people joined us late. Is there any other questions? Oh, yeah. Lots of questions.
Hi, I'm Kamaru from Malaysia. Nice to meet you again, Matthew. Congratulations, President Masisi and Delia. But coming from a country that's famously known as for the 1MDB episode, my question is, there's a worry about the pervasiveness of corruption at the lower level, from a traffic police, motorist giving. But when it happens at the very top tier of the nation, it has to do with supranational linkages and network. How would the TI report work against big companies, big brand names like Goldman Sachs, who has not really owned up to what has happened to 1MDB, and in fact is in negotiation for reparation damages. Is this the kind of reaction that we're going to get from such a big incident of corruption? Then what's the point of the CPI? Because it will keep on happening. And it will have the adverse effect of the younger population in my country, for example, seeing things like that. And see, the big fish will always get away because this is about big money. So if there's a movement here, we don't know what's going on behind the scene. Maybe you're talking to Professor Klaus Schwab. If there's so much emphasis on ESG, where is the emphasis of the stakeholder capitalism movement of metrics to also include the CPI into any big financial investment or development project around the world?
Thank you. So, who would like to tackle this very good bundle of questions? Do you want to go, Matthew?
Okay, I'll start with the question from Lacroix. So, while the new government has started off on a very bad footing, just for people in the room who aren't aware, our Prime Minister, Malta's Prime Minister, resigned not so long ago, and we have a new government from his same political party, but which has started off on a very bad footing already, because many of the people that backed up our former Prime Minister over the past 4 years of very aggressive corruption are still within the new government. And it seems that while he is willing to make some concessions, I don't think that his government feels the kind of anger at corruption that it should really be feeling. It doesn't seem to be honest. It seems to be more of a compromise rather than anything else. It doesn't seem to be rooted in any sense of indignation at the corruption of the former government. It seems to be more of a case of offering some sort of compromise in exchange for things calming down in the long term. But that's not really what we need now. What we need is someone or a group of people in government who are willing to go after corruption in a more aggressive way, and who feel an honest drive to fight it, rather than people who think, oh, let's just make this compromise now and in the long term everything will just go away. Because it isn't going to go away. Unless something really radical is done, then things will be left to fester. And of course, society will never move forward either, because the wound will just be left open.
Delia?
Well, I have lots of questions here, starting with the journalist from Botswana. We work through our chapters in more than 100 countries, helping governments or proposing laws or proposing mechanisms to hold to account those in power and the business sector in the country according to the situation of the respective country. So we have created lots of tools, and we keep on investigating and producing tools that allows the chapter in each country to tackle the problem or to investigate more seriously. For instance, this year we have been working on money and politics and campaign finance, and we have developed tools that allows citizens to see who is giving money to whom, in what amounts, and what is this money being used to. And this kind of information, access to information, facilitates then the detection of potential conflicts of interest or the evaluation of public policies, because if you can see who financed whom, you can explain sometimes what decisions has been taken in terms of public policy. So there are many tools. In terms of France, I would have to check all the sources included. This is an index of indexes, so we have to check what the sources corresponding to France, which are on our platform, so you can access yourself. But I compromise to check with the research team what are the descent figures in the sources that explain this statistical change. In some cases, the mathematical or arithmetical thing of 4 points up or down are not statistically relevant according to the margin of error. But we have to take care of that. I commit to do that and send you the information. You can do that. And in terms of extradition law, of course, this has to do with mutual legal assistance, because this is a global problem, as you mentioned. So we cannot afford to have islands of protection or islands of impunity, where people can go and bring the money and have a luxurious life without taking care of what they have done and without being sanctioned. So, stopping this mechanism of extradition requires, to be effective, global action in terms of convention or rules, standards that can be applied worldwide, globally. In terms of petty corruption is the one-to-one, the police, the people that has to pay for a place in the school or a bed in a hospital. It's terrible. It affects directly individual persons and affects human rights. And you have to consider that 2/3 of the 180 countries, 2/3 are under 50. So that means that billions of people are facing or are living in everyday corrupt environments, affecting their quality of life and their possibilities of future. The other type of corruption is grand corruption, which needs special responses because it is global, because it involves the highest levels, both at the government and the companies. And in terms of doing something or reflecting the problem of grand corruption, Transparency International has many other indexes and reports. For instance, Exporting Corruption is a report that analyzes what's the behavior of companies vis-a-vis bribing abroad, although they have their presential resident and tax resident in countries that are scoring well. So we have the Exporting Corruption report. We have done other reports taking into account how countries in the European Union, for instance, are fulfilling the anti-money laundering directives of the European Union in order to detect whether they are really fulfilling their commitments and the rules approved or not. And we reflect that. These are informations that are available for everyone, investors, companies doing business. And you mentioned investors, and of course, they can use this information to, in a certain way, determine where to go with the investment. And multilaterals, for instance, can use the anti-corruption information to establish conditionalities when they give loans to countries in order to incentivize the right behavior. So there are many things that we are doing, and there are different tools that reflects or picture different aspects of corruption. And the other one, which is very important and gives the information of how people perceive corruption and suffer corruption in their countries is the Global Barometer of Corruption. You can find it in our website. And it is not reflecting the opinion of experts or business people. It reflects the opinion of people in each of the countries where we are working.
Thank you. Let me just add to the answer given earlier to the question by the Botswana journalist on what Transparency International could do or is doing to reward the good efforts that we make in Botswana. We had an informal discussion early on with Madame Rubio about the possibility of the brand Transparency International, the institution Transparency International, in partnership with the Botswana government, hosting a Pan-African conference on anti-corruption to really deal with the scores across Africa, including those of Botswana. Now, it's in our national interest to help other countries come up to standard, particularly in our region, because we trade immensely with countries nearby us, but we've also subscribed to the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be extremely hard for business people to trade with some countries, I'm not mentioning any names, because of the indices that we see. So we would be advancing this. Mm-hmm. Our head of public services here, he'll advance it, and we'll find a mutually convenient time so that we do this, because our objective is to advance the annihilation of corruption and opportunities for corruption. And you talked about extradition, or somebody, I think, talked about changes in extradition law. Yes, we also experience it as a state. We need to have extradition facilitated in manners similar to exporting coffee or beef or whatever. There's got to be a demand for it and enablement of it across states, particularly for corruption-related issues. And I'd like to state that Botswana is yellow. It does not mean that there is no corruption in Botswana. It does not mean that we are necessarily better than last year, because these are relative measures. So we'd like to hope that one day we'll have an opportunity to actually start getting criteria and reference measures so that we measure our performance against our own standards and ourselves. So we genuinely improve and look at the rate of improvement. So, but be assured that we're really committed, at least politically, we're committed to doing all we can to make it extremely hard, if not impossible, for corruption to take place in Botswana. In the era of digitization, new challenges emerge every day. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
I wanted to mention before we close out the forum's work on Partnering Against Corruption initiative, which is called PACI, which is information that you can find also on our website. I encourage you to go to transparency.org to look at the report and look deeper on the findings. It sounds like we know there's an urgent call for action and collaboration. Corruption is definitely in one country, impacts all countries everywhere. And I thank my panelists for sharing their experience and their knowledge and expertise. And I thank you all for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alan.
Thank you very much.